This is the final part of the first week. It is a review of what I've been teaching to this point, and so I call it Stronger at the Broken Places. This is a review, this is a repeat. Thank you for bearing with me. It took me years to appreciate this. Again, this is also repeat. I know, but I really want you to get this. It took me years to appreciate something that is at once both simple and profound. It will be input from the outside and the patient's capacity to process, integrate, and adapt to the impact of this input that will ultimately enable the patient to get better. But more importantly, it will be stressful input from the outside, and the patient's capacity to process, integrate, and adapt to the impact of this stress that will ultimately jumpstart the patient's recovery. By tapping into the patient's underlying resilience, innate striving toward health, and intrinsic capacity to self-correct in the face of optimal challenge. And again, it's the input from the outside, and more specifically, the stressful input from the outside, that will provide impetus enough and therefore opportunity for a disrupting of the system. It's a little tricky if all you do is you write in your journal, and you can write in your journal and do a lot of Model 1 stuff and come to understand ever more profoundly, have ever greater awareness and wisdom and insight into and awareness of your dysfunctional internal conflictedness and dividedness. But it's that alone isn't quite going to do it. I mean, we really kind of need sort of input from the outside, not self-generated, although that's very helpful, and you can get to a certain distance by doing self-generated, but it's really the input from the outside, the input into an open, self-organizing, chaotic system, which indeed we are, that will provide impetus and opportunity for there to be destabilization and ultimately restabilization, reconsolidation at a higher level of integration, balance, and harmony. Therapeutic interventions themselves must therefore be optimally stressful, not only supportive, but also sufficiently challenging that they will provide the impetus needed to destabilize the patient's dysfunctional defenses, thereby creating opportunities for restabilization of those defenses at ever higher levels of functionality and adaptive capacity. And I say this repeatedly because in some of the extended courses that I teach, and when therapists will present their work, they acknowledge that it's just very difficult for them to do anything other than periodically interpreting and being empathic and saying supportive things and listening and responding in a respectful and thoughtful way. And it's very difficult often for them to bring themselves to challenge in addition to support. And again, it's always both and. Challenge and support, just the right balance. And again, I promise you, in the statements that I'm going to be offering, you're going to see how there is both challenge by highlighting the patient's adaptive capacity to recognize certain anxiety-provoking truths, but also then to support by resonating empathically with their need not to go there. So in essence, against the backdrop of empathic attunement, authentic engagement, secure attachment, and a therapeutic alliance, the therapist, by way of ongoing and judicious use of optimally stressful interventions, will repeatedly precipitate disruption in order to trigger recovery, thereby generating healing cycles of rupture and repair at ever stronger at the broken places. Again, it is not so much gratification as frustration against the backdrop of gratification, optimal frustration. It's not so much support as challenge against the backdrop of support, optimal stress, optimal challenge. It is not so much empathy as empathic failure against the backdrop of empathy, optimal disillusionment that is featured in self-psychology, that will provide the therapeutic leverage needed to provoke, after initial destabilization, eventual restabilization at ever higher levels of awareness, acceptance, accountability, all of which are adaptations to the stress or stressors of life, and are all about making the best of a bad situation. In essence, and now I'm hoping you really understand this one, the therapeutic action of psychodynamic psychotherapy affords the patient an opportunity, albeit a belated one, to process, integrate, and adapt to experiences that had once been overwhelming and therefore defended against because they were too much for the patient to process, integrate, and adapt to. Experiences that can now, within the context of safety provided by the patient's relationship with her therapist, be processed, integrated, and adapted to, i.e., can be mastered, thereby enabling the patient to extricate herself from the bonds of her internal conflictedness, Model 1, relentless pursuits, Model 2, and compulsive repetitions, Model 3. At the end of the day, psychodynamic psychotherapy is a story about the development of capacity, the development of adaptive capacity. Adaptive capacity, this is the last slide in this part and the last slide in this week. Adaptive capacity in the form of awareness of uncomfortable or discomfiting truths about the self, Model 1, acceptance of discomfiting or uncomfortable truths about the object, Model 2, and accountability for discomfiting truths about the self in relation, Model 3. And this is sort of another way of saying what's sort of universally accepted as being one of the goals of psychodynamic psychotherapy, and that is facilitating the patient's evolving from psychological rigidity and defensiveness to psychological adaptability, resilience, and flexibility. Thank you. That's the end of this week.